In this video, I'm going to show you a very exciting game played by Hans Niemann. The very famous American top player is back in action as he just started a new tournament in Zagreb, the capital of Croatia. It's a 10-player all-play-all, and in round 1 he is paired with the famous grandmaster and top coach Alexander Motylev. So let's have a look at this game. Motylev playing with the white pieces is a very strong theoretician. Plays the move e4, e6, the French defense, d4, d5, and we get to see the advance variation. c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, and Hans goes for the move bishop d7. It's a nice system, flexible system, and black is trying to put pressure against that pawn on d4. This is the main strategy in a lot of French structures. Bishop e2. And now the knight comes to e7 with the point of coming to f5 and hit the pawn on d4 one more time. Now you may think, wait a second, white can take that pawn on c5. Well, in that case, there would follow knight g6 when the pawn on e5 is attacked twice, as well as the pawn on c5. So black is about to win the pawn back. Therefore, white decides not to take the pawn on c5. Instead, castling Kingside is played. Now the knight goes to f5, pressurizing the pawn on d4 with the two knights, with the pawn on c5, and maybe at some point the queen will even come to b6. And this pressure is very unpleasant to face, so there follows d takes c5. And Hans shows that he is very well prepared. And rather than just taking the pawn back on c5, which is playable, but allows white to grab some space on the queen side by playing the move b4, he decides not to do that, but rather play the move a5 first, covering this b4 square, and after the move bishop d3, only now he takes the pawn on c5. And this is very interesting, and I'm pretty sure this was part of some very fascinating home preparation by Hans. Why is this so special? Well, after regaining the pawn on c5, white now just takes the knight on f5 with the bishop, giving up that good bishop. And after e takes f5, the pawn on d5 is hanging. So here we see that Motylev is a pawn up and even attacks the bishop on c5. But there is this move queen to b6, defending the bishop. And together with the bishop, you're keeping an eye on this pawn on f2, making it harder for the rook to move at some point, because that pawn needs to be defended. Well, queen b3 was played. Now your material up. It's very understandable that white goes for the exchange of pieces. And Hans says, well, you can go for the exchange of queens. First, I put my bishop on e6, attacking the queen. Queen takes b6, bishop takes b6. And why is this so good for black? Well, maybe it's not too good at all. You're a pawn down. You even have a double pawn. But black has the bishop pair, and especially this bishop on e6 and the bishop on b6. They're both really good. You have a lead in development, and it will be very difficult for white to utilize the extra pawn. So first things first, white needs to complete its development. So he goes for the move knight a3. Maybe the knight can come to b5 or maybe to c2. Anyway, black castles, and now rook e1. So the pawn on e5 needs to get some more support, because black will try to increase the pressure against the pawn. How he's going to do that? Well, let's see. Hans played the move a4. And now you may think this pawn is not really going anywhere. Well, after knight to c2, the knight is about to rejoin play. There is rook a5. This is the main idea. The rook goes to the 5th rank to put pressure against the pawn on e5. Right now the pawn is still nicely defended, but how is white going to untangle? That's not clear. Well, Motylev played here a3, so that the bishop no longer hits the pawn, but white has to pay a price for this move, because the rook comes to b5. Hits the pawn on b2. Okay, pawn is still defended by the bishop, but it shows that the bishop cannot easily leave its original square on c1. Knight b4. So white installs the knight on the b file, taking away the pressure. But now it's knight a5, and the knight is looking for ways to put pressure on white's queenside. Either the knight can come into b3 to attack the rook, but we will also see that there are other possibilities with that knight. Bishop e3, white is going for the exchange of more pieces, but the bishop goes to c7. The bishop doesn't want to get traded. Instead, it puts more pressure against the pawn on e5. White plays the move rook ad1. And now, of course, the knight may come to b3, but it's not doing anything there. So the move played by Hans, knight c4, definitely makes more sense. Here we see the pawn on b2 is white's main weakness. It's being fixed. It cannot move because the pawn on a4 covers the b3 square. And we also see that after bishop c1, this pawn on e5 is also attacked by the knight. So actually there is this option now for black to win the pawn back on e5. But if you do take on e5, there is this move knight d4. And I think this is a little bit unpleasant. You don't want to give white the opportunity to trade off the knight for the bishop. And instead, black played a useful move, h6. So the idea is that now if white would go for this move knight to d4, you can actually take with the rook on e5. That's making a huge difference. Why is this so special? You would rather take with the rook on e5 than with the knight, because this knight on c4 is very active. It puts a lot of pressure against the pawn on b2, and it doesn't enable the bishop from c1 to move. So black has won its pawn back and is in good shape. Well, understandably, that's not what white wants. Therefore, Motylev goes for the move knight d3, protecting the pawn on e5 one more time. Now, black has the option to control the d-file with its rook, putting pressure here. And there are even ideas to bring the other rook to d5 to hit the knight on d3 as well as the rook on d1. Knight d4 played. And obviously now the pawn on e5 cannot be taken by the rook because the knight on d3 protects it. That would lose material. So rook bd5. Everything is looking fantastic for black. Your pawn down, but a lot of piece activity. Of course, if you take the bishop, then there's a problem that the knight on d3 cannot move. It cannot be protected. If it moves, the rook on d1 will be taken, as both the rooks are putting pressure along the d-file. That's not an option. Pawn on e5 can be taken as well. But if you protect it with f4, then the bishop will come back to b6. And this bishop pins the knight on d4. And on the next move, you can take on d4, win the pawn back, retaining excellent chances to play for more. So instead, white played here the move king to f1. And now bishop takes e5. Black takes the pawn on e5. And that's very interesting because you would probably have expected black to take with a knight on e5 rather than giving up its bishop. Well, the idea is that if white would now take the bishop, this didn't happen in the game, there is knight takes e5 and everything is looking very active for black. For instance, if you take on e6, you take back with a pawn, and after rook takes d5, rook takes d5, it's now very nice that black has a knight still on the board rather than a bishop, because this knight has a lot of options. Can even come to d3 to attack the bishop and the rook. The king can come forward, and later black will advance its pawns, make a lot of progress on that side of the board. So therefore the knight is probably even stronger than a bishop. So black took with the bishop on e5, and instead of taking with a knight on e5, there followed knight b4. White hits the rook on d5, but the rook just goes back to d6. That's not a problem at all. The bishop is still defended by the knight. Knight goes back to c2. White is trying to hold its position together. Material is even. What should black do? Well, black has an extra pawn on the king side. So the extra pawn for white on the queen side cannot really be used effectively. But black has ideas to expand on the king side. Try to bring the pawns forward and gain space to put white under more pressure. So Hans played here this move g5. Well, now this is a very good plan, but it should be said that bishop f6 is probably a more precise move to move the bishop away from the e-file so that it is no longer under threat by the rook on e1. Well, let me show you. After g5, Motylev played a very strange move. He played the move h4. We will discuss that in a second. But for me, it's very important also to show you why moving the bishop away would have been more precise. If white goes for knight takes e6, so you're hitting the rook on d8, there's no time to take on d1. F takes e6, rook takes d6, rook takes d6. There is this option to play knight e3. White has a very cramped position, would like to initiate exchanges. After knight takes e3, bishop takes e3, maybe black is a little bit better, but not much. So in general, black, instead of trading off pieces, wants to keep pieces on the board. So a move like knight a5 would be ideal. This would have been possible had the bishop been on f6. But now the bishop is unprotected and white has a tactic. There's knight takes f5 and the bishop on e5 is lost. So white wins a pawn. So knight takes f5 is a very important tactical idea. If that would not have been possible, black is just clearly better with ideas to further make progress on both sides of the board. Back to the game. There followed the move h4. So white is trying to get rid of that annoying pawn on g5. There followed g takes h4. Maybe this move may have come as a surprise because look at the pawn structure for black on the king side. This looks awful. But what is white intending to do here? Well, Motylev played king e2. Maybe his idea was to go rook h1 and wrap up the pawns on the h-file. Well, it's also possible to take the pawn on h6. But now after f4, this bishop is a bit in trouble. Bishop g4 is a serious threat, hitting the bishop as well as the rook. And, well, you may go for something like bishop g5. But after rook to d7, this bishop still cannot do too much. Well, it can maybe take the pawn on h4. But don't forget that now the bishop is no longer on its initial square. The pawn on b2 can be taken anytime. And then white's pawn structure on the queen side just falls apart. So, well, difficult decision, but definitely I think Motylev underestimated this move g takes h4. Play the move king e2. Now the bishop goes back to d7, so rook protects the pawn. f4 was played to hit the bishop. The bishop goes back to f6, and now white plays knight e3. It looks as if step by step white is untangling its pieces, but things are not that simple. You can just go for the exchange of knights, and that would actually have been a good idea, because now, after doing so, you put a king on h7, you can get a rook to the g-file. Things are looking quite nice for black. He's just, after all, just a pawn up. But instead there followed the move rook to e8. I'm not sure this is such a useful move. Like, you're pinning this knight on e3 because the king is there. But look, white could just move the king away and, okay, black is better, but things are not that easy. But Motylev just makes mistake after mistake. Goes for the move king f3, getting out of the e-file as well. But now the problem is that after knight takes e3, bishop takes e3, the king is vulnerable, because I think the following move may have come as a surprise to white. Black has the bishop pair. You would not expect black to play here. This move, bishop takes d4, voluntarily giving up that good bishop for the knight. But the idea is actually very simple. After white recaptures, the bishop comes to c6 with check. Therefore the king is not doing well on f3. King f2, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, rook g6. Now we see a beautiful transformation of advantages. We had a bishop pair, now it's a rook endgame with opposite colored bishops, but the pawn on g2 is really weak. Black is about to win that pawn. If that pawn comes off the board, the h-pawn, the pawn on h4, will prove decisive. Therefore, only move here is rook to g1. I should also mention there is no time, no chance here to play the move rook e8 because the bishop covers the e8 square. So rook g1, rook g4, attacking the pawn on f4, bishop e3, and now white is completely stuck and black play the move b5. Look at these pawns on the queen side. Black is totally neutralizing white's extra pawn on that side of the board. And how does white activate its pieces? It's not easy. The bishop has to defend the pawn on f4, the rook has to defend the pawn on g2, as well as the king, so you cannot do anything. If you would play a move like g3 now, there is h3, and there follows h2, hitting the rook, and after that the pawn comes to h1 as the bishop controls the queening square. Therefore, no chance for white to to play the move g3. Bishop d2 was played, but now the bishop comes into e4. That's a nice spot. Bishop e3, white cannot do anything. Black, what is black's plan here? That's the big question. King f8, bishop c5, king e8. Bishop e3, bishop comes back to defend the pawn, and black just further improves its position, places the pawn on h5, bishop c1, and now the king comes to e7, bishop e3, king e6. The king just walks into the center, and where is it going? Well, imagine that white just keeps on doing nothing, just go back and forth with its bishop. The king will just walk in to the weakened squares on the queen side. Bishop e3, king c4, bishop d2, king b3, hitting the pawn on b2, bishop c1, king c2. Look at this position. This is total zugzwang. White cannot make a move without avoiding the loss of material, because the rook has to keep the pawn defended as well as the bishop. If the bishop moves, the pawn on b2 will fall. After that, the pawn on a3 may fall as well, and black just has a newly created passed pawn. That is game over. Of course, Motylev saw all this coming and didn't want to allow the king walking in that easily. Took a drastic measure here by playing the move c4, giving up the pawn. But after b takes c4, bishop d2, the king comes to d5, and still it's zugzwang. You cannot do much. Bishop e3 was played. It looks as if the black king, at least for the moment, is not able to infiltrate. But wait a second, c3, it's a pawn sacrifice. Fantastic idea by Hans. B takes c3, king c4, attacking the pawn. Bishop c1, king takes c3, bishop e3, king b3, bishop c1. Looks as if you're in time to defend the pawn, but wait a moment. There follows this move, rook g8, and it's game over. White resigned here. Maybe this may look premature, but the rook is about to come in, for instance, to c2 with check to hit the king, hit the bishop, probably win the pawn on a3 at some point, and then the a pawn is decisive. And note that the rook on g1, it's still totally stuck, unable to move. Fantastic game by Hans, who from a relatively interesting, well, it was an interesting pawn sacrifice. It was compensation, but not more than that. But thanks to this compensation, thanks to this pawn sacrifice, he managed to put pressure on his opponent, and he showed his class and completely outplayed a top grandmaster. Let me know what you think of this game, and definitely soon more about Hans's tournament in Croatia.